have the distinct pleasure to have Blake Bullock as my guest today. Blake Bullock is a vice president at Northrop Grumman in the company's space sector. She holds both undergraduate and graduate degrees in astrophysics and astronomy. She has held leadership roles leading key projects, including NASA's James Webb Telescope project for over 15 years. So, Blake, before I even get started and ask you the first question, I have to ask you, does that make you a rocket scientist?
I would say it doesn't make me a rocket scientist, but it definitely means I get to hang around the actual people building the rockets.
Wow. I mean, it sounds pretty close to a rocket scientist to me. So that's great. So now I'm going to ask you the question that I ask everybody at the very beginning of this podcast, because, it's fascinating to see, we hear this title and we hear the bio and we say, wow, but there's a story behind that, right? There's a person behind the title. So if you can talk a little bit about your leadership journey and how did you get to be this title and how did you get to be where you are today?
Sure. And I appreciate the question. I remember feeling the exact same way. It felt like such a mysterious, far away, hazy world to get into kind of the executive leadership ranks. And, I think my first real taste of high pressure leadership was when I was the captain of my rowing team at UC Berkeley. It was a Division I rowing team. And I remember being really taken aback that the team, without any discussion with me, had voted for me to take over as captain. And it made me think, why was that? And why are they singling me out? Why are they asking me to do that? And it was, I would say, the beginning of my journey to start thinking about what does leadership mean? What does it mean to the people we're serving? And what does it mean to us in our organization? So I think that was my first aha moment that, wow, my peers who I really respect and admire have singled me out. And it probably gave me a little bit of confidence as I headed out into the working world, into my first job in government when I was working for NASA, to start really thinking about and seeing myself as potentially in bigger and bigger leadership roles. And especially working in the government for NASA, I was really drawn to the bigger policy and bigger financial policy type of decisions that are being made at the highest levels in government. Of course, in federal government, you really have that unique opportunity to see the intersection of budget and policy and politics. And, I was really lucky that my beginning of my career was coincident on some level with the very early stages of NASA's James Webb Space Telescope, and had the opportunity to see that as a young person on the government team and see from a distance the process of deciding who we would trust from an industry perspective to go off and start designing and building this thing. And then later took an opportunity, a big pivot for me in my career was leaving federal service and taking a job at Northrop Grumman, where I am today, to have an opportunity to be on the other side of that exact same conversation. And actually, I think that was an important checkpoint for me in terms of my leadership journey, because it was a really great and maybe somewhat rare opportunity to really dig into what empathy means in a leadership role. So to have been the person on the other side of the negotiating table and to have had that perspective and to have had been in those closed door meetings where I really understood what mattered, what the stakes were, what the environment was like on the government side of that team. And then to take that with me onto the industry side of the team, I felt I was able to bring a real insight that was different from some of my colleagues who had, started and stayed on the industry side. And it's the funniest thing. I always joke about, no matter how technical or, how extremely complex a role might be or an organization might be, it just never seems to fail that, such a huge fraction of your day and of your career in leadership is about people and is about emotions and communication. So I think that launched me into a really kind of a different person in the company that I joined. And I was able to use that perspective to help us better respond to what the government needed and, play my role at that time to help advocacy of the mission as it went through some very significant ups and downs and some real threats to its continuation. And I think just using each one of those lessons and experiences to piggyback on the next one as I kept venturing into new unknown territory throughout my career.
The one thing that you mentioned is this whole notion of people. And, I talk to so many leaders and they're brilliant, right? So they're really good at what they're doing, highly competent. And yet the people piece is the piece that gets in the way sometimes. And I don't mean in the way in a negative way. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that that was going to be such a huge part of my job. I just thought, I've got all these degrees, I've done all these things, and I'm just going to focus on that. And a large portion of their jobs, is the people piece. Do you think that you realized that early on when you were going in your career, that would be such a big piece of the leadership piece there?
What I did eventually come to appreciate was just how big of a needle mover it was to be able to harness people's enthusiasm, energy, people's hearts. And no matter how technical the role is or how kind of, quote unquote, obscure a subject matter area or isolated a certain expertise might seem. And certainly in a company like Northrop Grumman, we have some of the best world-class people who understand something so narrow, better than anybody else in the world. And it just seems like, how could this possibly be, there's no room for emotion in something this technical, but over and over again, I learned that it was. And so much of that, I think, was that some of the universal truths about people want to be heard. People want to understand how what they're doing is contributing to the next level of integration. And people want to feel respected and they want to feel like they belong. And although, many people can go off into a corner and do incredible work all by themselves individually, it's such a big needle mover, the way people work and how they engage when they feel heard, when they feel respected, when they feel motivated. A really funny story I want to tell you, but I'll never forget was, it was working on one of our big restricted space programs. We had a really complicated technical problem, and I was leading the meeting. There were probably 10 people around the room. For the most part, very senior, probably 20 years older than me on average, folks that had seen things I've only read about in books and had so much depth of knowledge. And I was walking through the conversation, talking about the plan, how we're going to approach the problem, and it went on for about an hour. And at the end of the hour, just before wrapping it up, I said, hey, I haven't heard anything from you, Jim. Can you comment on the discussion? And he said, sure. None of that's going to work. And I thought, he wasn't going to volunteer that.
Right.
And of course, it really made me, it was sort of funny in the moment. And of course, we were able to take his really great input into consideration for that particular issue. But it really was an aha moment for me of, do people feel that they're being invited to participate in a conversation? Is there something about the way I'm describing things that makes it sound like a foregone conclusion? And he just go back to his desk and think, so unfortunate that we're going to do this thing that wasn't going to work. And meanwhile, I'm assuming, well, of course you would stop me. So that was a big aha moment, that people, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are. If you don't feel like you can bring that information into the conversation at the moment when it matters, then I don't have access to that.
I love that story. And it's so prevalent, right? I mean, so that's not an isolated incident. I mean, that happens all the time. And I hear stories like that all the time, but it's the authority piece, right? The intimidation piece, all of those things. And so we lose so much when we're not in tune. So I love that. So if you could give yourself, your early career self, okay, so remember yourself starting out, some advice now from where you sit, what would you tell yourself?
She probably wouldn't have listened to me. But
try anyway, right? Right.
I think I really would have tried to emphasize, there's really no need to panic. There's really no need to feel overwhelmed. And I viscerally remember that feeling of being so young and early in the career and finally being invited into the room and just feeling, oh my gosh, I only caught 90% of what that conversation was, whether it was technical or as budgetary jargon or financial terms, just feeling like this is impossible. What could I possibly contribute here? I'm, scribbling down notes and trying desperately. And I have so many questions. There's not hours in the day enough to get them all answered. And sitting in that discomfort of, kind of frantically after the meeting, going up and looking up a bunch of things and asking a bunch of questions, but, only getting some subset of that information understood, and then going to the next meeting and that feeling like the I Love Lucy conveyor belt with the chocolates falling on the floor.
Catch them all.
Yeah, maybe outdated reference, but just felt very, very much like I was experiencing it. And I would say to somebody, that is okay. Sitting in that discomfort and not speaking the language fluently, don't panic. And it's just such an opportunity to be present and to recognize I'm in the room, I'm not out of the room. This is happening in real time. There is no pause button, time's marching on and you get what you can out of it. But to understand that, kind of trust the process, that if you're working hard and you're focusing and you're asking questions, you don't have to panic. And of course, hard work is critical. Of course, there's table stakes that you're really pushing yourself and you've really done your homework and you've prepared. So I'm just taking all that as an assumption, but knowing that you've done that, and oftentimes you get into the room and it still doesn't feel like enough. It still doesn't feel like you understand all of the context, that to just, pick on something and dig into it, take what you can out of it. You are who you are. You got in here for a reason, whether it was for your talent, hard work, or pure luck. Here you are. And be present, be there, and don't waste your limited energy and passion on criticizing yourself and panicking about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much wisdom in what you just said, right? Because it's not, my experience, right, when I work with a lot of executives, as you know, is that never ends. Like, you can tell your early career self that, and then I talk to people who are moving into executive roles or, getting promoted into a CEO role, or, and it's still there, right? That's still that, I don't know what I'm doing. And so there's a piece there that I'm hearing from you is like, give yourself some grace. You're in a learning mode, and you're always in a learning mode. And I think what I'm gathering from what you're saying, and I would encapsulate, is that never stop learning too. There's been a lot of research about this whole notion of the concept of imposter syndrome, where people have these experiences of feeling like a fraud, like I don't belong here, that people are going to find me out, that I really don't have what it takes to do this. And what we know from research is 70% of people, not just women, because we attribute this a lot to women executives, but people experience this, in various phases of their career. Have you ever had any bouts of this, or bouts of like extreme self-doubt? Mm-hmm. And how, if you have you dealt with it? And if you haven't, how did you go about not having that? So either one.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I think it's interesting. And when I sort of personally dissect the term, it's so loaded, right, culturally, because it sort of presumes I'm imposter, so I'm pretending to be someone else. And so who is that existential other that I hope other people think I am? And it kind of, when I put it in that light, I'm pretending to be this woman who looks like this. And who is that woman? And who is that person who's behaving this other way that I'm measuring myself against, and kind of remembering that person doesn't exist. And if there is an actual person where, I really, I just hope people think of me the way they think of Janet. It's like, well, now I'm presuming to understand a whole level of complexity that I don't have access to about somebody else's experience, et cetera. And it's funny because I think we tend to think of it as sort of being humble, I don't deserve to be in the room. But in some ways, it's also a bit narcissistic, right? That there is this other perfect version, and everyone around me is looking at me and judging me and measuring me against this other non-existent person. And it's sort of like we're not, right?
Right.
How many times are we, or am I individually sitting there and thinking, she's really doing a good job pulling off her fake, competency, and people aren't focused on that. And in the
Exactly.
bizarre situation, right, where somebody was focused on that, it doesn't matter and it's not useful. I have one particular story that comes to mind when I had a very high pressure confrontation, and it was about when the James Webb Space Telescope was about to be was basically on the chopping block to be canceled by the Appropriations Committee on the House. And it was a really stressful time, and people were really trying to figure out what's the value proposition. And I remember a moment, it was somewhat earlier in my career, mid to early, and walking into a group of people that were very intimidating to me, who from my outside perception, which of course I don't know what's going on in their brains, but they all looked a certain way that was different than how I looked. And they all, felt to me from the outside part of a group that I wasn't a part of. And I think, we have to be real about, there are some realities about all of our unconscious bias. And, if you're a woman, if you're a young woman, I've always personally felt like, okay, those are two strikes against me at that stage of my career before I open my mouth. So one wrong word, and that's my third strike. There's some reality to how that works in everyone's mind, in my own unconscious bias and everyone else's. I think remembering that you have something to say and you say what you need to say, and then there's really no person out there to be an imposter for that we're trying to measure ourselves up to. I think we all need to be really conscious of, are we looking for some entity to validate or approve of something that we're doing? And of course we have bosses, and of course we have networks and people we trust. But at the end of the day, that can be a really confusing and big drain on our time and energy if we're sort of, chasing some kind of existential validation. I think it's a trap a lot of us can fall into, especially high achieving people who are used to.
Exactly. And it's all about the validation and the external and what do other people think versus, hey, and it actually takes away from being able to contribute because you get clouded.
Mm-hmm.
If you're there's only so much room in your brain, right? And so you have all these thoughts about, oh, what are people thinking? You're not really bringing forward what, the full contribution you can bring. So you mentioned making mistakes. So I've got to ask you this question. Have you, we talk about, again, I think sometimes we look at people and we think, oh gosh, they're the epitome of perfection. Like, oh, it's looking up at a certain level or certain things people have done. They must do everything perfectly to get where they are. But the reality is, and you just said it, we all make mistakes and we all have failures or what we perceive as failures at the time, which could be learnings. But have you ever experienced some sort of failure that you'd like to share or some mistake that you've made that would be helpful and that you learned from? That was really a learning.
How much time do we have? No, I'm just kidding. And I think honestly, if you're not making mistakes at a pretty good clip, you're probably not operating aggressively enough in a changing environment. I think if you're never making a mistake, and hopefully they're small mistakes or recoverable mistakes, but I think, like you said, it's that hitting the bumpers and being able to course correct is the path to really break through to something profound. I think, for me, what comes to mind, I remember a recent experience where I was working on an international agreement with a really diverse, big group of team geographically spread out, and had to make some high stakes, fast moving decisions. And I took the information I had, I made some decisions, then we moved out on those. At the end of the day, I felt I made the right decision, but what I realized was I failed to bring everybody on board with me the way I needed to. And I think I learned that in this case, I had really missed an opportunity for the cultural sensitivities of different ways of doing business in different regions of the world. And I think as many of us who are, increasingly working in a global workplace, are facing these things, maybe, vastly more so than would have happened in decades ago, those things matter. And I think it kind of helped me shine a light on, what are some of my habits or unconscious biases around the traditional corporate American culture and that rugged individualist type of model that fall flat in other organizations potentially. And it was a real lesson to say, like, you may have, made the right decision and gotten the win you wanted in the short term, but did you get there the right way? And I had to go back and really, ask myself hard questions and go back and talk to those people and mend some bridges. And I was really fortunate in that some of the people who I think I could have handled our relationship better and were generous to talk to me about it afterwards. And I did ask, hey, looking back on this and I'm seeing it differently. And I was able to get some really candid feedback, and it was hard to hear, but I needed to hear it. And I think kind of the ability to hear hard feedback instead of just sort of plastering over it with all the natural tendencies to be defensive and make excuses and caveats, is to not jump to that so quickly that you don't actually hear what is actually quite a precious gift of critical feedback.
If I can stop you there, Blake, for a minute, not to put you on the spot, but what would be a behavior, just like one simple behavior that you would do that you would do different?
I think what it taught me to improve and grow on was that one-to-one outreach to the right people to say, hey, this is coming. Here's where my head is at. I understand that this might be hard or challenging or create, another set of obstacles. Here's why I'm leading this way. And it matters to me how this makes you feel. And it matters to me, the shared outcome. And before we go and lay this out, like, I want to hear from you. And at the very least, I want you to hear from me about the fact that your input here matters and your reaction matters. And I'm committed to getting us both over the finish line when we get past this point. And I think it was skipping over that step in the interest of time and kind of just pushing forward. I didn't take the time to make some one-on-one connections and some more empathetic, honestly, opportunities for feedback that probably would have, in the long run, saved me time.
What? See, and I ask, thank you for humoring me there and actually answering that, because I think that it's such a simple thing that you just mentioned, right? But there's so often, and I see so many executives with the same thing, is that we're so busy. It just, those are like the little things, but those little things are big things in the end, yes. Right? And so I'm really glad you bring up that example. I know that you are in the field of exploration, really, right? So space, it's so exciting. It's the future. But so let's take that same mindset and apply it to leadership, exploration. What do you think is now going to be needed for the leadership of the future?
It's timely as we look at the rate of change around us. And, in my line of work in aerospace and defense, some of the most urgent impacts onto how we do business is the threat environment around us, things that could disrupt the peace and harmony of communities all around the world. And I think what that really necessitates is a different kind of leadership model. I think we have to really challenge ourselves to break away from that traditional, tried and true, monolithic kind of line management kind of view of how to do leadership. I mentioned empathy before. It does bubble up to me as probably the key word that differentiates the kind of leader we're going to need going forward, because the speed things are changing, the complexities around the equities of people top to bottom who live on this planet with us. There's not a ready cut model of how to face these things. And so I think you can't do calculations fast enough to get to the right answer. And even if you could, there are no equations that exist for the types of problems we're trying to solve. And I think that allows us to turn back to the beauty of being human beings, is that I think we have this special compass inside of us where we can detect things through empathy and through listening and connecting with people and creating relationships that are ultimately, in my opinion, going to end up being key factors in how we make decisions going forward. We can do all the math in quotes to figure out the right answer in quotes, but ultimately, are you perceiving things that only a focused human mind in a face-to-face experience can really adequately perceive? Are you processing it through your human side, your brain and your heart and your gut simultaneously while all the complex math is going on at high speed in parallel? I think those are the kind of things that are going to save us from, all kinds of disasters and challenges that threaten us. It's that ability to cut through all of the complexity and say, like, what is this really about? Am I really hearing the person on the other side of the argument from me or the negotiation from me? Am I understanding it? Am I missing the point? So, while again, it's table stakes that we have all of these skills, all this experience, all this, in the case of my field, technical abilities that we bring to the table and being able to use the tools in the tool belt, speak the language we need to speak. If you skip the part about human empathy and connection, you really won't be able to put those tools to work in the most optimal way.
You're speaking my language, Blake. I so resonate with what you're saying. And I think, you bring up this thing that we often call a soft skill, right? The empathy and the heart, or in the heart and soul sometimes, and they're really not soft skills at all, and so it's like reframing that those are the hard skills. Right. So finally, let me ask you two parting questions. What inspirational quote encompasses the wisdom you'd offer as inspiration to women leaders, to all leaders who are listening to this?
So I'm a big reader. I love, the opportunity to really sit with the wisdom of other people who have done incredible things. I will say the one that jumps out to me more recent, there's an author, Glennon Doyle, who has a podcast and has written some wildly popular books about empathy and courage and thinking differently. And in reading one of her books, the quote that really hit me and stuck with me was, "Stop asking people for directions to places they've never been."
Wow.
And
wow. I get the goosebumps on that one. Yeah.
It kind of loops back to that, what we were talking about earlier about validation. And it's this kind of like, hey, I need advice. How do I do this? How do I do that? And many people will freely give advice, many of them very well-meaning and have wonderful experiences and advice and perspectives to share. And I think those are all wonderful things to take advantage of. But at the end of the day, no one knows how to navigate what you're navigating, because nobody has been who you are, where you are, come from where you've come from, and is going where you're going. So I don't interpret it as, go it alone, don't listen to anybody else, but it really is like, this is a complex journey that each of us are on in our lives. And, take other people's perspectives and advice when they're useful to you, but know that the only advice that matters at the end of the day is the voice inside of yourself.
Well said. That is some very wise advice that I'm sure people are probably just silent right now listening to that and letting that sink in. That's really great, because you captured so many things in that quote. So what other parting words of wisdom would you give to people that are listening to this and are struggling to find their leadership voice, or trying to establish themselves as who they are as a leader?
I would say, don't give up. Don't be quiet. We need you. We need to bring more voices to the table. And there isn't a good path that's sort of mathematically laid out. And it's funny because you will see sort of equation looking tables and graphics of this is how you proceed through your career. And some people love those. And it can be
5 steps, right?
Yeah.
Do these 5 things and then you've arrived, right?
Yeah. And those can be great. And it can be a great illustration and a great tool for thinking through options. But at the end of the day, I always love to joke, my own resume, I look at it, I think, wow, like, who's that person? Well, they really plan things out nicely. And of course, we Resumes are a great summary of the high points, but it was such a twisting, turning journey up and down, rights and lefts, reverse. And, it's such a great to have an opportunity like this to share some of that. I don't think we talk about it enough, but just kind of knowing that whatever you're exploring, you have to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And as long as you're present, you're taking advantage of the opportunity that you're in right now, and you're being present and you're taking that in, you are on your journey. And if where you want to go is to, continue to advance in leadership roles, then do that. Keep being there, make that known, talk about that, and have your voice be heard. And, push aside the voices of, whether needing validation or needing a path or needing the perfect advice or the perfect mentor, and just keep doing what you're doing, and keep leading from where you are. The people around you. I think, there's always this notion of like, well, once I'm the boss, this will be so different. And it always gets a big revelation to people that I always ask people, like, do you think that really once you're the boss, people do what you say? They don't nearly as much as you sort of think they would, because so much of it is about finding that common path and motivating and tapping into what matters to get people moving in the right direction. That's what leadership is. And those kind of skills, all of us can work on where we are right now. And for women out there who are excited about becoming a leader, I applaud you. I support you. Keep going. The rest of us are out here and we're cheering for you. There's definitely room for you. Be your authentic self and keep working hard, stay focused, and be present, and you will get there.
Wow. I feel like I'm talking to Yoda. So I know that people will really benefit from your wisdom, your sage advice here today, Blake. So I really appreciate it. I mean, I've known you for a while, so I knew that we were in for a treat when I talked to you, but I thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, and for encouraging all of us along the way. You've definitely helped me reach my dreams, and if I can connect with anyone else to help that bigger journey, it's just such a privilege to be able to be part of that. So thank you.